I'm delighted to have two really great scholars on this panel, where we're going to talk about project leadership for sustainability, resilience, and just futures. And they're with me here in the panel, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a minute. But I want to just say a few words as to why we wanted to discuss this topic. So we see the increasing number of non-traditional forms of projects that are around that we're beginning to study as project scholars, whether that's about disaster management or kind of new forms of crisis management. And as we think about project leadership in a changing world, we certainly at the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership are really interested in this question of sustainable, resilient, and just futures. And indeed, we have a theme on that within the University of Sydney, and it's a topic that's beginning to be explored across the world. And so perhaps I can hand over first to Dicle, and maybe you can just introduce yourself, and then we can hand over to Nader. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Dicle Kortantamer. Hi, everyone. I'm based at the University of Leeds. I'm a lecturer there. I specialize in project leadership. So I guess that's a short intro of myself. But I think, Jennifer, you pointed a really kind of important issue there that, projects are changing, and we are also seeing different forms of projects. And what does it mean for leadership? It's something we've been discussing with the John Grill Institute as well while I was there and visiting. And one of the things I want to emphasize here is that our current models of leadership need a bit of revision. Currently, ethics tends to be subsumed under the issue of effectiveness, which kind of makes it slightly problematic for things like resilience and justice. I mean, we do have ethical leadership models, and they've come into play since the 1980s in the US, like transformational leadership, authentic leadership, very much, also came into our field. But what we've also seen from research is that, we can't rely on them. We've got, for example, Dennis Turish's research that showed the spectacular failure of Enron was based on transformational leadership. And we've got Matt Alvison, who's been showing us that authentic leadership can lead to narcissism. So, sorry, my camera froze there. But so we've got, I think, food for thought there. And I think we also need to think about individual resilience as well. We're putting a lot of pressure on people who are in these leadership roles. And we know that, from research that brings emotional labor with it. So we also need to think about those things. But finally, I don't want to keep this very long. I think there's also something to think about the capacity of leadership, because we're looking at some really complex issues around future making. How do we make a better future? And that requires, more kind of capacity around questioning what that means and how do we get there. And both from a leadership side to prompt those questions, but also we know from research that also requires active followership, the kind of things we mention when we say constructive dissent. How do we make sure kind of that we kind of also contribute to whoever's in leadership positions to steer that in the right direction in terms of justice and fairness and resilience. So I just want to put those ideas out there as a starter, and then we can have a conversation around these things.
Thank you, Dicle, and you're generating a lot of thoughts in my mind, and I'd really like to make this as interactive as possible. So can I just encourage participants to put your thoughts into the Q&A, and we've got an opportunity here to have a bit of discussion around these topics. But before we get into that discussion, Nader, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jennifer. My name is Naderpajouh. I'm head of the School of Project Management at the University of Sydney. And I study mostly what Jennifer suggested as our point as a non-traditional form of projects, disaster management projects for resilience of societies or communities and their infrastructure systems. So just a segue from what Dicle was suggesting, it will be interesting to see in these situations, what leaders do we need, and also what these situations would result, what type of leaders do we get as a result of this situation. Especially, we can see this globally, what would be the transition on the type of leaders that we are getting. In the Institute, a couple of months ago, we hosted a convoy from Indonesia, from the government of Indonesia, and we hosted executive leadership program, but specifically on disaster management with my colleague Aaron Updike. And you can see from them the demands that they are having, the problems that they are facing are changing, and they are responding on a more complex situation. They need to involve their communities, and they need to prepare for a very uncertain situation. So a lot of theories that we have are in leadership are put in test, and we see that how we are demanding for a different form of leadership in the field.
Thank you, Nader. And just to encourage people again to put some questions into the chat, I want to perhaps start off by following up on what you're saying, Nader, and just sort of throwing that question perhaps at Dicle. So we know leaders are always juggling a range of trade-offs as they're delivering projects. They've got these trade-offs and dilemmas that they're dealing with, especially in these environments where there are multiple stakeholders who may have very different value systems or very different desired outcomes out of projects. I wonder, as we deal increasingly with sustainability, and climate change and its impacts and the need for resilience, what insights do you think can you offer from that leadership literature? And I think you've started to unpack that, but maybe you can unpack it a little bit more for us.
Sure. I mean, yes, the main message that's coming through is that there are a lot of trade-offs, there are a lot of complexities, and we don't have a simple answer, and that's where leadership can actually add value. So I want to bring the conversation back to ethical leadership and ethics, because that the research shows that should be our guide. But I also want to caution, and this is one of the kind of conversations from the literature and the knowledge we have, that we can't fully rely on competency models. Yes, they will guide us, but they do reduce this complexity, and they do rationalize it. There's also emotions in this, there's ethics in this. So we just need to be very, very careful not to just say, that's the silver bullet, and if you have these competencies, we'll be fine. What the research shows us is that, this is a negotiation that happens in situation because of the amount of uncertainty and the diversity that we're facing. The situation evolves, and therefore, we need our kind of leaders to be negotiators. But that negotiation, I guess we still need a bit more kind of understanding. We've got some guidelines in terms of ethics. A lot of the discussions in the literature around either ethics of care or ethics of virtue. Just to give a quick snippet, ethics of care is more the hand-holding. So, our kind of hand-holding and interaction and that kind of dialogue with our communities and our ties, whether that's at a national level or at a more local level. And ethics of virtue is more around defining what's good, the meaning of good. And there, obviously, we open the space up for politics and power as well. And we need to be careful about that, because who makes the knowledge claims about what's good, and how do we determine that? And, it's not that, currently our project management leadership theories and research is based on utilitarian ethics, which is about optimum good for the majority, which is also fine. But I guess what I want to put on the table is, we've got different options. It's really about being, my research also shows that it's about explicitly reflecting on those choices and really kind of making those negotiations as we go along. That's going to be valuable, because there is no clear-cut, simple answer that says this one's better than that. It is going to be about figuring out which one will work and why, and what are we kind of losing, who loses, who wins out of that, and what can we do about that? How can we, and we've been talking a lot with you, Jennifer, on Mary Parker Follet's work. She also brings in, she's a management theorist from, 1930s, really wonderful woman, who says, we need to be more innovative in our thinking because there might be some new ways of solving these problems that benefits more people. So how can we be, more innovative in terms of finding solutions that can actually make who loses less, or kind of come up with different ways of dealing with these trade-offs?
Dicle, thank you. I'm going to ask, I'm going to throw a question to Nader now. I mean, you're making me think about, the time pressure that sometimes these people are working under. And, Nader, given all the work on resilience, and I know you know the literature on resilience really well, what do you think project leaders need to know to manage for, to lead for resilience in these projects?
Again, I just want to, in the form of making it as a conversation, I want to take a little bit from what Dicle was suggesting, and the need for the care that we need in the leaders in this situation, which are very uncertain, a lot of change, and we need to ensure resilience of our reference as a leader, but whether it's a community, whether it's an infrastructure that we are managing or a project that we are managing. And you can see that if we go at the start of our conversation, the discussion was that there is a lot of pressure on the leader. So from one side, we have a lot of pressure, and from the other side, we need these leaders to have to provide even more care, which makes it a little bit more difficult and unbalanced. And it's a form of a paradox that we are facing. From one side, we want the leader to care more. From the other side, there is so much pressure that they might not have capacity to care for it. But this is not probably the only paradox that project leaders would face in this highly uncertain, highly changing scenario. So in the face of crisis, one thing that one point that we are facing, and I think roughly one of the questions also in the question and answer, but while I was seeing before, is touching on it, is that we are trying to ensure something in the long term.
Yeah,
and
I want to come on to that in a minute, Nader. Can I?
Yeah. But I just add one thing, that in the form of a crisis, what we need from our leaders is that to support the people who are moving from one project to the other project, because when we are responding into a crisis, from they need to be sure that it is connected to the previous role that they are having.
Yeah, good point. And I think it's interesting to know what people need to be thinking about up front and what they need to be dealing with in that exact crisis moment, if you like. So I'm going to move us into the questions, and perhaps we can just reflect on this idea of timescales. So, sustainability is a long-term agenda. When we're thinking about making futures, we're talking kind of long-term. How far in the future should leaders set the strategies? And how long is the intended design life for projects? So just something about this sort of timescale that project leaders are dealing with. Dicle, do you want to start us on this?
Sure. It's a wonderful question. I think time is a big question there. I just want to link it to the previous conversation. We've got time pressures, deadlines, but at the same time, we're trying to kind of create this future in the long term, the question mark, how far into the future? And what we know from research is leaders obviously always have to juggle those two as well, because, when you need to deliver something today, what does it mean for delivering something tomorrow, and how much do we know about that? I mean, there are some theories out there that are starting to emerge in the leadership literature that, and also some of your work as well, Jennifer, in future making, that, maybe it's not necessarily about really knowing where that, what kind of a future that is, but it's kind of figuring out your way as you go through, and leaving your some of the research also shows leaving your options open. So a lot of this leadership research is starting to talk about asking the right questions, which I've also seen in my own research with very uncertain COVID type response programs. But also, how do you keep your options open so that you can evolve and change direction when you need to and turn into a different trajectory? This is also some of the other research that I'm talking about. So I think how far into the future you look is a good question, but also, how do you get there in terms of not narrowing your possibilities is something I'd like to throw out there into that mix, and perhaps more for leaders to think about in that space.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice that this conversation is reflecting perhaps some of the discussion in the last session about the uncertainty and emergence of projects, and I think of Sarah Coleman's presentation, for example. I want to come on to Graham's question. So with long-lived mega projects, if you think of something like infrastructure, then resilience and maintaining vigilance on ethical decision-making is an ongoing challenge for project leaders. How can we refresh and renew through the life of a project?
Shall I have a go at this, and then maybe Nader can come in? There are different ideas here, and I think we've still got time to learn. We've still got a bit of a trial and error on this. In our field, it's more around kind of, can you hand over the baton to different leaders? Some of the work, Jennifer, you've looked at as well. But in the leadership kind of research, there is this whole constructive dissent and the active followership. That you also, this is what I was trying to get to in terms of capacity, because people might be people in leadership positions might be pulled down through pressures. They might get tired. It is that active followership that needs to kind of also keep them at their toes. So everyone has that kind of responsibility, and no one can kind of go aside and say, well, I wasn't told to do this. So I think there's a bit of a mindset shift about active leadership, active followership. But I also know from the COVID response projects I looked at in my own research, they actively, especially in a crisis situation, they actively change people because they do get burnout, because it is an extremely difficult condition. So they have this planned out at a very top senior level, SRO level, that they're going to change these people regularly so they get fresh blood into the project. So there are different approaches, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Dicle, you're reminding me of some of this high reliability organizing sort of literature around things about kind of how do you put teams together, or sort of leadership teams together, where people can question each other but also kind of support each other. And I know they did a lot of work on that, on things like aeroplanes, right? So that the second pilot could question something. They didn't feel so overwhelmed by the hierarchy, that they could question something if there was something that they felt was going wrong, but that they kind of could work together, and they really improved the reliability of certain airlines by kind of doing that kind of work with teams. And maybe we need to be thinking about that more in project situations, given that we're dealing with these kind of crisis situations and some questions that we've never really had to think about before around how projects can intervene in positive ways. Nader, I don't know if you want to add to something on that. I noticed there's quite a few questions coming in, and so I do want to kind of get through them.
Yeah.
Something you just want to add?
I just want to bring probably to what Dicle was saying, that in practice, and give one example. That, for example, in asset management, in infrastructure, we are always planning for the life design of the infrastructure. And in some of the engineering practices, one of my PhD students, he was modeling how do we integrate the different shocks and stressors that are coming during the lifetime. For example, an earthquake, a flood. And then we were noticing that if we consider them within the timeless scale, it would be very, very different. And then we were asking ourselves, how does a manager would think? Because if I'm a manager for 4 years, I would just think of my incentives within 4 years. So we optimized the model for these 4 years within the 50 years. And we did it also for the 8 years to compare, for example, if a leader is working for 8 years or 4 years, how would be the difference? And the difference was not visible in a short term, but if you put it in the long term, it was very, very visible. in ensuring the resilience of this infrastructure. So just going back to the first question, it is important to have that long-term vision, but also these time scales of the leaders with their incentive mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to pick up on Roger Swinburne's comments. So, I mean, I think this idea of design for flexibility is an interesting idea, and that's how I'm interpreting your comment, Roger, but it's also something that there is a little bit of literature around. So colleagues like Nuno Gill and Bruce Tether have done a little bit of work on the way in which some of these mega projects, you know, try to design the systems, the subsystems that they can treat as stable, and the ones which there's going to be more change in. And I think that idea of design for flexibility is really interesting around these questions of sustainability and resilience. So I'm going to move us on to Sujwan's question. So with the emerging requirement of sustainable development, what new project leadership styles, or more importantly, leadership practices, will be valuable? I think we've touched on it a bit, but do you want to think particularly about this sort of, you know, the emerging rules of sustainability, the requirements that are suddenly coming out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. And I think, you know, as researchers, we're still kind of trying to find our way around it, but we do have some guidance. I think we did touch on it. There is a lot of uncertainty around how things will evolve. And there are a lot of tensions. So I think, you know, because when we talk about sustainability, and it's in some of the questions and comments as well, even the different stakeholders might have different time horizons, long-term, short-term. You know, you get into that whole trade-off / uncertain technological and policy development. So really kind of going back to that, asking questions, but we also see a lot more collective leadership models, which we again touched on, but we didn't really detail it. And there we see things like, sorry, my camera went off again. There we see different models as well. The model I mentioned around passing the baton on to different leaders. But we also see, for example, in some of my research, that stakeholders can also take some leadership positions. So it's again thinking about, I think I like the leadership practices word there more than styles, because I think we need to think about, as a systemic kind of perspective, how can we increase the capacity to deal with this uncertainty, be highly reliable, but also adaptable to what's going to come up, because yeah, it's a highly uncertain environment.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just reflect on a couple of things that we've been thinking about, which is really this sort of systems approach, you know, and then seeing projects as interventions into bigger systems. And so for me, you know, I'm less concerned with individual leaders, and I'm more concerned with these practices of leadership, because I think in these big complex projects, it's often not down to one heroic individual. It's down to a set of people working together, and you know how those people collaborate to get the right kind of outcomes. And you know, it's interesting, you know, to contrast perhaps the kind of these kind of long-term projects and how we achieve sustainability through the long-term projects, and how we address specific issues of resilience through these kind of much tighter projects where, you know, Nader, in the kind of work that you do in some of your research around dealing with a disaster such as a flood or a bushfire, and where you need some rapid response and you need to stand up an organization quite rapidly. And I think there's quite an interesting sort of tension, and you know, it's just important to kind of tease out those different things perhaps. So I'm going to move us on to Waiting's comment, and I think Chen Zhang has got a similar comment, right? So they're asking questions about novel technologies to address the complex nature of sustainability, you know, emerging 4.0 technologies, and the challenges and the opportunities that they provide sort of for these new requirements for leadership.
I mean, there is a lot of discussions and conversations around this also in terms of artificial intelligence, right? And I think where the conversation's going is that these technologies are, you know, traditionally they've looked more like automation, like some of the previous technologies, but we're moving into augmentation space, which is where they might also become, you know, working humans and technologies work, collaborate together, they become a team member. So I think it's about really thinking a bit out of the box to see how we can use them, because they will help us, especially, you know, we know machine learning and other technologies have already started preparing all sorts of scenarios around sustainability and also other things that we can kind of look at. But I guess, you know, I'd want to throw the question out there for those in leadership positions, you know, can we take it further than our maybe traditional scheduling, etc., to more like kind of creation of a vision and working together with stakeholders to understand these trade-offs, you know. That's where I see the main value lying with those technologies.
Yeah, Nader.
And yeah, I just wanted to say that it would also impact the practice of leadership. So, for example, as you write in your work, Jennifer, for example, the issue of being in different places and work, and that simultaneity of the practice that technology enables. So that would impact the leaders and the extent of the reach. And as Dicle was suggesting, AI, for example, how do that support them in different ways of sense making, and then developing the practice and action plan and responding to the situation. So it would be another disruption on top of a disruption.
I mean, I feel like there's a big opportunity for the research community here to look at ways in which AI could be used to address, you know, non-monetary measures, right? So I think there's a lot of work going on commercially around schedule and cost. But when we start to get into sustainability resilience, we start to talk about a whole range of other things. And, you know, I think it's interesting to think through what is and isn't being done in that space, and what the opportunities therefore are for us as research community. I'm going to move us on. So Roger's got a question on the big time gaps between contract terms, business case timeframes, and asset design lives. You know, how can we tap into long-term value when there's short-term contracts and business cases?
It's an incentive, I would say. It's an incentive mechanism that we would create for the leaders of the project, which would be beyond their tenure. I think that would be the most simple answer that I could have.
I fully agree with Nader. A lot of research and a lot of things we've done always shows that, you know, incentives and sometimes also the political cycles, organizational cycles contribute to this. And also, I guess we might need to revisit some of our contracting habits and practices as well, perhaps more flexible ways that can kind of better deal with uncertainty. As you said, Jennifer, there's already work being done in that space, but definitely in terms of leadership, the incentives are very important.
Nicola has a question, which we in the research community would say was about temporalities, right? So it's about different understandings of time. So we often see conflicts arising between temporal orientations, long-term, short-term sustainability, between project proponents and local communities. How can project leadership help in these situations?
I mean, one of the things we haven't discussed, but we see in our research and other research in temporary teams also, is that, you know, sometimes it's about making these mental models or these differences explicit and really putting them on the table, because I guess sometimes it's assumed or goes under the radar, but if we can make them explicit and we can have a conversation and a negotiation around it that is based on, you know, grounded in some form of ethics, I think then that's where the project leadership can add value to really surface them, to really prompt a lot of those questions and discussions.
Okay, Nader, I can kind of get you to answer Roxana's question around how organizations support project leaders in maintaining their own resilience and mental well-being.
Yeah, and that was kind of my response also even to previous question, that for having that responses and engaging the community, they need the support to be the leaders need to be resilient themselves and work in a spectrum of actions that they would consider. Sometimes they need to engage the community as much as possible. Sometimes they need to go in a very top-down way of actions. But the support can be in different form, in the different forms of organizational capabilities that we can offer to the leader. But main thing, probably main factor would be that to train them in this situation. So the leaders who have been through this crisis would be better equipped to respond to the next crisis, and they should embrace and learn from this situation for the next one. Another very important training is the anticipation of what is coming up, and always they should anticipate the disruption that they might face.
I mean, if I can just reflect, so I think we're sort of coming to the end of our conversation, but you know, I think there's for me, this has been really interesting, both for thinking about how we deal with resilience and sustainability in long-term projects, and also then for this question of, you know, how do we deal with these projects that are responding to crises and disasters, and, you know, what are the skill sets that we need for both of those if we're going to move into a world that's more sustainable, resilient, and just. I know there's other questions coming through. You know, there's questions about different cultures, there's questions about all sorts of things, and I would just like to ask you to respond to them, you know, perhaps offline if we can. And just a final comment, if you would like, Dicle and Nader, and then I'm going to have to bring it to a close.
I think we've covered a huge ground, but I would encourage everyone to kind of question some of our assumptions. I think there's a lot we can think as a field, as a profession, and it's really about opening our thinking to those alternative ways of doing things to better cope with these situations.
I would like to highlight exactly what you mentioned, Dicle, and we see. We would be very open to what is happening, and going back to what I said at the start, what we want and probably what ethically we would want to pursue, but also contrasted with what we get in this situation. And this might be very helpful lens to look at the leadership and how they would impact the scenarios that we are facing.
Okay, my gratitude and thanks to both of you for coming online and having such a great conversation. I think it opens up lots of areas for us for reflection as practitioners, but also for research, and thank you again. Thank you.